All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night to all of you out there, wherever you happen to be. My name is Voice of Wind, and we have sound and video today. It's a good day. Ah, it's a weird day. So, first, I just want to say hey to Tyria and to Stephanie. Thank you both so much for being here. It's good to see you. Today, we're doing things just a little bit different. So, I'm sure that many of you are like me, and you just kind of consume whatever content comes your way. Let me readjust things. I've been playing with wires and making sure that everything fits, so we've got to make sure everything is in frame, right? Yeah, we've got Cthulhu back there. Good deal. Okay, so I've been consuming content, and I really enjoy, going through YouTube and looking at, you know, trans-based content because I'm trans. Surprise, you kind of relate to these things. And I've been going through my transition now for over 5 years medically, but I have known that I was trans for much longer than that. And so every once in a while, because YouTube's algorithm is a jackass, it will feed me things that I don't really want to see. And sometimes those things really piss me off. And so today, before we get to the games, I'm going to discuss a little bit of one of the videos that I saw that I just cannot stand. And it's worth going over because of how much is in that video that is bad. Not because the opinions are bad, but because the science behind them is bad. And when you put opinions out there that are not based on science and are not based on actual research, but are based on that thing I Googled last night, you are putting out a message that your information is just as good as everyone else's. And so I at least want to try and do a little bit of countering that bad information, because these are things that I actually care about. These are things that I actually study. And I don't just study them in the sense that I go to Google and I search for them. I study them because I live this life and I deal with it on a daily basis. And I have a master's degree where I study these things to look at trends in the data. So these are things that I look at often. So we're going to talk about some of these things. I can't go into all of it because it would absolutely bore all of us to death, but I'm going to go into a good chunk of it. The other thing that I want to say is that I'm not going to post any of the video itself. We're going to go over the transcript, and we're not going to go over the whole transcript because it wouldn't solve anything. It wouldn't help anything. And I don't want to cause any issues with any of the other algorithms. So I'm going to go over the main points that I saw that are problematic, and we'll discuss some of those things. So what's important when we talk about science and actually looking at the facts behind things? Well, we want to look at things with a skeptical eye, right? So we want to question things. And when we question things, and when we start doing actual studies on things and research, what we need to remember is that there are two main ideas. The first big idea is that evidence matters, and there are different kinds of evidence. And with that idea in mind, there are two kind of concepts there as well. So the first is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, right? So this is the first kind of big scope idea. And so the kind of concept that goes with that is, if I tell you I have a dog and her name is Socks and she's a border collie, you don't need a whole lot of evidence to believe that. And I can probably just show you a picture if you don't believe it, and you probably would believe it at that point. But if I told you that I have a large red dragon that's 250 years old who's named Socks, you probably wouldn't believe it even if I showed you a picture, right? You'd want more evidence than that. So there's a different level of evidence that we expect when we make different claims. So when we watch videos and things on TV, we should keep in mind that we should proportion our level of belief to the level of evidence that we're given with the claims that we're given, right? So that's the first idea. So we're going to stick with that idea in mind. And the second major concept is that anecdotes are not evidence. So if I tell you a personal story, and I tell you a story about a friend, or I tell you a story about a doctor's office, that's not evidence either. It's an anecdote. And you can take that for what you want, but at the end of the day, you should not take that as truth. So it's a claim, and you can take that as whatever level of evidence that you want, but it is not necessarily truth. So we'll take a look at that as we go. So I'm just going to hop into the transcript, and we will take a look at some of the things that we can pick up along the way. Okay. So we're going to start with the transcript from the video. This is from Blair White's latest video of her interview with Buck Angel, and this is the transcript from that interview. So we're going to start at around the 2-minute mark after the fluffy introductions between the two of them. Now, if you don't know, Blair White is a conservative trans woman, mid-20s. I don't know her exact age, but she started transitioning in her mid-20s, so she's probably around 30 now. Buck Angel is a trans man. He has been in adult film for a very, very long time, and he's in his late 50s, early 60s, and transitioned about 30 years ago. So they're both conservative. They both have ideas that are conservative in nature regarding trans issues, and they have had a recent discussion that came out 3 or 4 days ago talking about the recent discussions on whether or not children should receive trans services and really at what age people should be allowed to transition. And this kind of goes into the idea that the recent laws that have come up in Florida, in Texas, in South Carolina, in Alabama, in Oklahoma, etc., that have basically said that kids are not allowed to transition in any form, change their gender identity, or any of those other things. The two of them believe that those are the right way to go because you shouldn't transition until after you become an adult. So let's kind of look at what's going on here. So let me make this a little bit bigger so it's easier to read. That looks like it should work. So at about 2 minutes in, we have a conversation between the two of them. So we have, I feel like I'm very connected to you and I'm in alignment with you, which I'm not in alignment with a lot of other people in the community anymore. And it's sad because I really love the community and I think the community is important, but I don't feel we really even have a trans community anymore. We go back and forth between considering myself a part of the community because there are times where you know you have other trans friends and you know where you're hanging out with them sometimes. And I'm like, oh man, this is a community, like we're having fun or like whatever. And then other times, you know, you go online and the discourse is just antithetical towards real life. Like it contradicts so much with what it is to be a real trans person existing in the world and to be trans. It's like we're supposed to be so freaked out about bathrooms. We're freaked out about pronouns and all this stuff that doesn't make its way into my daily life at all, right? But yet it's the biggest discourse, you know? That's right. That's right. And it's one of those things I brought you here because I feel like pronouns and bathrooms are one thing. They're the most pressing issue. So right off the bat, instead of discussing what's important, they distance themselves from the community. And they distance themselves from the community by literally saying up front that they don't have to deal with the standard discourse that most trans people have to deal with in their daily lives. And they start that off by saying that the biggest discourse that they hear is pronouns and bathrooms as the most pressing issues. Well, for older trans folks, that is the most pressing issue. Blair White and Buck Angel, are older trans folks, and they don't have to deal with their transition anymore in terms of going through and dealing with a doctor for surgery, for transition care, for any of that. The only thing they've got to deal with at this point is hormones, which are a prescription, which they get probably on a monthly, 3-monthly, 6-monthly basis, and their standard blood checks. So why would they worry about surgeries? They only worry about that if they're looking at the political discourse, right? And so it makes sense that they wouldn't hear this every day. So why do they hear about pronouns in bathrooms? Well, that's what makes it to the political discourse. So let's take a look at our first set of quote-unquote data, right? So if we look at the bathroom bills that they discussed, the most recent set of bathroom bills that we've got on record are 2016 and 2017. In 2017, we had a total of 16 states in 2017 that tried to pass bathroom bills. So Alabama, Arkansas, Illinois, Kansas, Kentucky, Minnesota, Missouri, Montana, New York, South Carolina, South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, Virginia, Washington, and Wyoming considered legislation that would restrict access to multi-user restrooms, locker rooms, and sex-segregated facilities on the basis of a definition of sex or gender consistent with sex assigned at birth or biological sex. And 6 states went to municipal or county level anti-discrimination laws to try and stop those. And 14 states withdrew, they had considered legislation that would limit students' rights at schools and then withdrew that later based off of federal guidance. So this is why they heard it talked about, because this legislation is still going through the systems, right? These were proposed in 2017. It's only 5 years later, and we've been stuck in a pandemic for the last 2 years. And so we've got to deal with this stuff, right? So we're still talking about it. And we're also still talking about the actual dialogue that's going on. So here is the first link for that. So that is the bathroom bill legislation. In the actual polls that have gone on, we've had polls that were conducted in 2015, 2016, 2017, and 2019. And you can see in the green and red areas here that support for transgender individuals to use bathrooms that correspond to their birth sex versus opposition to laws that would require trans individuals to use bathrooms that correspond to their birth sex is approximately 50-50 in the US. That's why it's still talked about today. As early as 2 years ago, this is still a discussion that Americans are having. So it's important to talk about because legislatures are still trying to pass these bills. So this is why we still talk about it. If we look at just anti-trans bills overall, if we look at just the last 2 months, we're looking at a bill to restrict sporting events, school-sponsored sports, women's sports, gender reassignment in children, Women's Sports Act, Fairness in Women's Sports Act, school aid for, looks like school sports and a bathroom bill, participation in female sports, provisions for gender transition procedures, law enforcement agents in public schools to not have to use preferred pronouns. That relates to speech pathology, limit biological sex designation on birth certificates. That relates to indecent exposure. This is another indecent exposure. This relates to teachers not having to use a student's preferred pronoun and instead use the one on a birth certificate. Parental rights for education records. And so these are just the last 2 months, right? So we're talking about what goes on in a locker room, in a bathroom, and in kids' sports. So these are why we're talking about bathrooms still. Go figure. I don't know why this is such a talking point, but this is why. So there's our links. We'll post those to the chat because I want you to have the actual data. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Good on you. Okay. So this is legislation over the last 2 years in the US, right? And it's not just the US. It's a worldwide thing. But these two conservatives are from the US and they care about the US and they care about, what's going on around them. So that's why we're kind of focused there. We will go back later and discuss more. But this is where we're starting. Okay. So 3 minutes, 50 seconds in. So from here, the discussion finally gets off of the idea of pronouns in bathrooms. And now we get into one thing we can talk about. Whatever their kids really getting messed up by the direction this ideology is going, physically, mentally, and emotionally. So we're both in agreement, and we can get into the specifics, but we're both in agreement that transitioning is not something for kids. And, there's always exceptions to any rule. And I believe that there are some kids that might benefit from this, but on the whole, I disagree. They've started calling it fast tracking, the pushing these kids. Puts parents in a very, very, very vulnerable space. It's not fair to the parents, and we're not putting the actual real information out there. Okay. So we've gone from bathrooms and pronouns to the idea that transitioning now is an ideology of the left. So how did we get here? How did we get to this idea that we have an ideology? Well, what is an ideology? An ideology is, at its base, an ideology is a political idea, right? It is something that you push onto the majority in order to follow a certain set of guidelines. But as far as I can tell, and I'm pretty sure that you'll all agree with me, trans folks are the minority, and we don't really have the power to push any ideologies. And as far as I know, out of all of the folks that I know, and this is anecdote, so don't take this as truth, but as far as I know, the only ideology that I hold to is that trans people exist. Full stop. Surprise, it doesn't go past that. What more do you want from us? We're not pushing this on children. We're not pushing this on parents. What we're saying is that you can be born and believe that your mind and your body don't agree with each other. And that's okay. Exactly, Ellie. Trans rights are human rights. So, what do other people say? We have the Media Diversity Institute. Now, I don't know who the Media Diversity Institute is, but this is what they say about the conservative narrative. So the inaccurate and transphobic narratives about trans people spreading globally and locally say that these people are trying to corrupt children and impose transgender ideology on the majority by inverting the relations of power, portraying the transgender people as a force that oppresses the ordinary man, rather than a marginalized minority that in most parts of the world still lacks basic human rights, such as adequate access to healthcare services for medical transition and legal recognition of their gender. Right? That's the only thing I'm trying to spread too, Ellie. All we want is recognition of our gender and the right to medically transition and the idea that our rights should be the same rights everyone else has. So we've got increased visibility. I mean, that would be nice, but I'm not going to cover the rest of this, but if you want to figure out more of what the trans ideology is and what it is not, here's the link for that. We should have the right to live. I agree entirely. So I think we've kind of dispelled the trans ideology at this point, and I'm going to hop on from there. So the next idea is that we are fast tracking kids into transition. So we're going to hop into that now. We're 5 minutes in. So 5.5 minutes, they say the leftists try to use very vague terms to say affirming care and trans health care. And to get very specific here, Lupron is the drug that is known as puberty blockers they give to children at 11 or 12 to block puberty. And that's the same drug given to those people in prison to sterilize and chemically castrate. So I don't know how much. I've been doing a lot of research on Lupron because, look, I want kids to be happy and I want them to move forward in a world. But when you start to do the research on this puberty blocker, holy crap, I can't even believe what it is and how if people actually want to see the truth in this actual drug, there's no way anyone would be okay giving that to their child. The long-term effects. Do you know that they did studies on this in Finland and in Sweden for 20 plus years and they've shut it down? Yeah, here, shut it down. In a lot of countries and in Europe, they're actually rescinding the guidelines that children need to be given puberty blockers because it's having negative ramifications. Okay, let's talk about that. So let's start out with this claim that children at 11 or 12 are being given puberty blockers that are the same things that people in prison are being given to sterilize and chemically castrate them. So Lupron is used for that. I have no issue saying that. But let's look at what Lupron actually is, right? So Lupron oh goodness, Wikipedia is not great for searching like this. Lupron is used for hormone-responsive cancers, such as prostate cancer and breast cancer, and for estrogen-dependent conditions, such as endometriosis and uterine fibroids. It can be used for precocious puberty in males and females, and to prevent premature ovulation in cycles of controlled ovarian stimulation, for IVF. And it is controversial since Lupron label advises against the drug when one is considering pregnancy due to birth defects. Okay, so those are its major uses. It's also a GnRH inhibitor, so it can be used as an alternative to antiandrogens like Spiro and Cyproterone, and it is used as a castration device as well. So we talked about 2 uses on the conservative side, and we have 5 major uses for its standard use. Researchers have recommended it for a puberty blocker only after age 12, when a person has developed a Tanner stages 2 and 3, and then as a cross-sex HRT treatment at age 16. And that label is off-label, and it's not approved by the FDA. And it's not for long-term use. So we're not talking about long-term use, like these 2 are talking about. And we're not talking about using it for chemical castration, which is also not a long-term use. So we're not talking about the same things at all here. The studies in Sweden and Finland are based on long-term use, and so of course they shut it down for that. And the other issues that they're talking about we'll also get into. So Lupron, you can look up on Wikipedia. Standard puberty blockers, you can also look up on Wikipedia, but they just postpone puberty in children. There's more than Lupron, right? So they've only mentioned 1. There's 5 different kinds that are used in standard in the US, and there's far more than that across the world that are used. So we've only brought up 1. Why only 1? Is it because it's the one that's used in prison and you're trying to fearmonger? I have a feeling that's the case. Otherwise, I don't know why you would bring it up. So I think there's a little bit of bad ideas going on here. So there's the article on puberty blockers. You've also seen people claim that doctors will go as far as surgery on trans kids. So we're going to talk about that. Unless they're talking about intersex kids, in which case it was done prior to the child's request without permission. Yes, we will get into that. So let's talk about the actual side effects of puberty blockers, because that actually matters, right? So there are very, very limited studies that suggest that bone density is impacted. There's also support for an argument that timely use of it in trans youth and not allowing prolonged periods without sex hormones doesn't affect it. So that's it. While some hormones are suppressed with the use of blockers, sperm and eggs will not be produced. However, if they want to preserve genetic material, the blockers can be stopped and production can be allowed to resume. So short term, you can still have children, right? And that is the case for many of these blockers. Puberty blockers do not make children transgender, nor do they substantially increase the likelihood of further medical transition. Individuals taking blockers as part of gender-affirming care may go on to use gender-affirming hormones, or they may not. There's no guarantee either way, right? Because the diagnosis was correct, the person was indeed trans, and they desired the hormones and physical developments that aligned with their gender rather than those that their body would naturally produce. Further, the use of puberty blockers in early adolescence reduces the likelihood of future invasive treatments for those who do go on to medically transition. So this is the basics for puberty blocker side effects. And they are generally reversible. So we're going to talk about that here in a moment too, right? So we've covered that. So as we move forward, so children need to be, they're rescinding the guidelines that children need to be giving people blockers because it's having negative ramifications, right? So we're going to jump to 9 minutes because the rest is just fluff. Yes, absolutely, Ellie. It permits someone who's questioning their gender more time to answer their own questions. So, at the 9-minute mark, the conversation comes back to it finally again. And they say if they don't do it in the right way, they don't talk about sterilization. To me, the conversation ends at, do you believe children can consent to sterilizing themselves by 12 or 13? Well, we've just shown that that's not the case. Do you believe a child can decide they don't want to have kids without their life and everything else? I feel like is just an added argument that can be it right there. But no one talks about, well, that's because the right, or whatever you want to call them, the people who are really pushing against us are using all those things to push again and not understanding that there's no nuance, that the key to a lot of what's happening today is there's no discussion and no middle ground to a lot. And the kids who have dysphoria, you don't like to call them trans kids. I call them kids with dysphoria because there are people with dysphoria that are not trans. There you go. So once you start labeling something, you've now immediately pushed it into a space. And then why do we have a huge amount of detransition children? 20-year-olds, to me, is still a child. Okay. And then they go into anecdotes for a long time. So before we go into the anecdotes, let's talk about this. So we just talked about puberty blockers. Puberty blockers are not permanent, and they are given at about the age of 10 to 13, somewhere in there. So, what are the interventions for adolescents, and what are they actually told? Let's go to the WPATH, right? Let's go to the source. What is the WPATH? So, for those that are not aware, the WPATH is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, and this pretty much defines the standards of care for the health of transsexual, transgender, and gender nonconforming people. This is for the world, right? This is the standard that the world is supposed to follow. This is the newest version of it. This is version 7, and I encourage you to take a look at it, because if you want to know how trans people are being cared for, by their doctors. This is the guide. And going outside of this is allowed, but this is generally the standard of care that everyone is going to follow. So if we take a look at this, we can look at the table of contents here, and it is kind of gatekeepy, but it's gatekeepy for a reason, right? Because doctors cannot read the minds of children. So what I want to do here is show that what they have said is that the conversation ends at children are just straight up allowed to sterilize themselves at 12. And I want to show that that is not the way that it works. So doctors are allowed to go off book from the WPATH, but the WPATH sets the standard. And once doctors understand the guidelines, they can go off book when they know how to handle their patients. If they know their patients better, then the guidelines serve as a rule of thumb more than the textbook to play by, right? So it's going to be a little bit different, but it is, how do I want to say it? It's it's not the rule, it's the, I forget the phrase. It doesn't matter. In any case, all I really want to point out is this is what doctors are being taught. Whether or not they follow that is up to them. So if we look at assessment and treatment of children and adolescents with gender dysphoria on page 10. So let's hop down there, right? And I want to skip just a little bit past that. So here we go. There is a psychological assessment, right? So psychological and social interventions for children and adolescents. So before we quote unquote let these children sterilize themselves at 12 or 13, we are supposed to broadly conform to the following guidelines. And I'm using the language that these conservatives have used. So please just bear with me. So we're going from this idea that 12 or 13-year-olds don't know what's going on to letting the professionals help them make this decision, right? So before we even make an intervention with a child or an adolescent, a mental professional is supposed to help the family accept and nurture a response to the concerns of their gender dysphoric child or adolescent. That means that families play an important role in the psychological health and well-being of the youth. That means that they've got peers and mentors, right, from their community. That means that their parents support them. So before the child gets treatment, they need to have a good support structure. That's important. Psychotherapy should focus on reducing the child's distress related to dysphoria and psychosocial difficulties, right? Families should be supported in managing uncertainty and anxiety about their child's decisions and their outcomes. Mental health professionals should not impose a binary view of gender because gender is not binary. Clients and their families should be supported in making difficult decisions regarding the extent to which their clients are allowed to express a gender role. And professionals should support clients and their families as educators and advocates, but not make decisions for them. And they should help them with authorities such as teachers, school boards, and courts, right? And they should strive to maintain a therapeutic relationship with gender nonconforming children, adolescents, and their families throughout their interactions, right? That's it. That's the important part. Make sure the child is supported, make sure the family is supported, and make sure that the family and that child are making the decisions in a knowledgeable way, acting as an advocate, right? Sounds pretty logical to me. So now the child wants to start taking puberty blockers, right? Well, that's a physical intervention. So what are the requirements for physical interventions? So fully reversible interventions. This involves the use of GnRH analogs, which is what we're talking about, puberty blockers. So that is the first category. There's also partially reversible interventions. That's hormone therapy. That's not for 12 and 13-year-olds. That is HRT. So those are partially reversible. And then irreversible interventions are surgical procedures. So that is area 3. So I want to look at fully reversible interventions first. Look at this. We've got a highlighted area, the criteria for puberty suppressing hormones. It's highlighted. I wonder why that's highlighted. That might be important. So before youth are supposed to get puberty blockers, they have to demonstrate gender nonconformity or gender dysphoria, whether it is suppressed or expressed. That means that they don't have to do it in public, right? Their dysphoria has to have emerged or worsened with the onset of puberty. And there's got to be psychological, medical, or social problems that interfere with treatment, and that those have been addressed. And they give informed consent. It means they have to be able to give informed consent, right? That means they know the risks. That means that their parents and their caretakers know the risks and can also consent, right? So those are the things that are put in place. So in this interview, for them to say, do you believe children can consent to sterilizing themselves by 12 or 13, that they can decide to have kids that can't have kids later on for their entire life? It's not the way it works. We've discussed that this is not permanent at this point, and there is a system in place for doctors to assess whether it is okay for adolescents to take blockers, right? So I think that we've handled that pretty solidly. And if you've not read the WPATH, you should. As Ellie said, it is gatekeepy, but this is the standard of care that most doctors follow. And if you know the WPATH generally, you're not going to fall into these ideas that are being espoused by these two conservative trans folk. The follow-up that we have after this is that they say a huge amount of detransitioning children, 20-year-olds come up to them. Then we've got a lot of anecdotes on how stopping hormones earlier rather than later is a good thing. So these are the things we have to keep in mind, right? Anecdote is not evidence, and we don't want to turn all kids trans or gay. We want the LGBT plus kids to survive and grow up happy and healthy. Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree with you 100%. So what we learn in this next little bit here is that Buck Angel, if he was to transition back to a woman, he would be a horrible woman. Because look at his privilege. Wouldn't it be such a bad idea to detransition now? And this is such a horrible take. You do not transition because you pass or don't pass. This is not the way transition works. You transition because of internal feelings and the way that you see yourself mentally. It is almost, I don't even want to say it almost, it is never based on the way that you feel you will look in the future. Transition is for gender dysphoria. It is to fix the mental image you have. It is not to fix the outer appearance. It is to make the outer appearance and the inner appearance congruent, right? So I don't understand this line of thought at all. And I don't think it's even worth really addressing. The only point worth talking about here is Buck Angel and Blair White have tons of privilege, and they've got plenty enough money that if they had any issue with the way that they look, they could get it fixed, and it wouldn't be an issue. Yippee skippy. It's easy to look the way you want to when you've got the money to do it. And we know that they've both used their money to do it, right? They've talked about it. It must be nice. Not all of us have the money to medically handle all of those things. And we're going to talk about that later too. Okay. So, then we talk about detransitioning again. One of the things, this is at 1350, one of the things I think the trans community suffers from is all the talk about how conservatives and right-wing people live in the past. I think of a large extent, leftists and trans people live in the past as well. Oh yeah, because they're still going on about the old statistics about how 0.1% of trans people detransition. Okay, let's catch up to 2022, where there's Reddit groups of 28,000. Okay. Right, a lot of us don't even have the money to afford hormones. I'm totally with you there, Ellie. You know, this is not about passing. This is not about getting hormones. This is not about getting medical treatment. This is about making the mind line up with the body as much as possible. This is about alleviating gender dysphoria, because if I could make my mind line up with my body, it wouldn't be an issue, right? This isn't about the outside. It's about up here. There's probably a better way to put that, but in any case, let's look at this specifically. So, we have lots of old statistics. So let's look at those old statistics. So this is the one that they're talking about. They are always talking, and when I say they, I'm talking about conservatives. They're talking about the US Transgender Survey from 2015. So for this survey, I'm going to hop to the end of it. It is the reason suicide rates are so high. I agree. So if we take a look at this survey, I'm going to hop to the end because this is where we get the majority of the data that we need. So total initial sample size, 38,916. Total cases removed, 11,201. Either for consent, ineligible, didn't finish the survey, not in the US, they didn't meet the gender identity, there were duplicate responses, incomplete responses, or illogical responses, right? So on data cleanup, didn't show right. So at the final end of it, we've got 27,715 responses. So that's what we're going to concentrate on. And we're going to look at page 111 of this. Detransitioning. So this refers to anyone who has gone back to their sex assigned at birth at least for a while. So 8% report that, right? And most of them only do so temporarily. So let's take a look at those numbers. So of 27,715, 8% had to go back, right? But 62% of those retransition. I know that's a terrible phrase for it, but we're just going to go with that. So 2,217 detransition, and then 62% go back. So 38%. So I am specifically referring to their cherry picking. So I want to look at this 0.1% of trans people. I want to look at this 0.1% specifically. That's why I'm going for this. So I'm only looking at the section on detransitioning of the total that were surveyed. So that's what we're looking at. That's why I'm going to this specifically. So that's why this is the key here. The rest of this report is worth reading, but it is like 300 pages, and I don't have time for that right now. So we're only looking at this section. And I want the actual numbers from this section so that we can take a look at it. So I want to know how they get this 0.1%. That's where this is all going. So 2,217 detransition, and 38% of those remain detransitioned. So this times 0.38, right? So that's 62% started their transition again. which means that 38% remain detransitioned. That's 842 and a half. Let's say 843, right? So 843 out of 27,715. So let's take a look at that. 843 divided by 27,715. That is 3% of the total. Okay? Now, of those, it specifically says 5% of those who detransition reported that they had done so because they realized that gender transition was not for them, and that represents 0.4% of the overall sample. The most common reason cited for detransitioning was pressure from a parent. 26% say it was due to pressure from other family members, 18% because of pressure from a spouse or partner. So, in all of the cases that we look at, of these 843, only 5% of them did so because of their own thoughts on their gender. 95% of them detransitioned because of pressure from a parent. Transitioning is too hard. They face harassment at a job. They have trouble getting a job. Pressure from family members, pressure from a spouse, pressure from an employer, pressure from friends, mental health professional, religious counselor, harassment outside of work. It did not reflect the complexity of their initially thought gender identity, financial reasons, medical reasons, or otherwise. So, this is where we get the 0.1%. So 843 people. And now we know that really only 5% of them, or 42, didn't feel like they were the right gender. So that's 42 out of 27,715. There's our 0.1%. So that's where this number comes from. This is where they cherry picked this number from, this 0.1%. And it should actually probably be rounded to 0.2%. It's 0.1515. Regardless, what they are now saying is, this is old statistics. This is 2015 data. It's actually 2017 data. But the series of polls is from 2015. And they're saying, that's not accurate to today. Look at how many people are in the D-trans group. So let's take a look. So, here is the link for this report if you want to see the whole thing. That does link to the PDF. It is a big PDF. It's 300 pages. Have fun with that. So, let's take a look at this group. So, this subreddit has currently 28,800 members. Now, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to assume, and it's a big assumption, that in this group, every single person is a real person and is a detransitioned trans person, right? You'd also like to present the idea that just because one stops hormones and medically detransitions does not mean that they do not still consider themselves trans or something near to trans, like a crossdresser. Absolutely. Right. So, this detrans group specifically, they are trying to say these are people that detransition because they are part of that 0.1%. When they say that 0.1%, what they are saying is these people detransitioned because they actually were the gender that they were born as. That same 0.1% that we just looked at in the survey. So, let's assume, just for a second, that all 28,800 of these people are real people, not bots, not paid for by anyone else, not double accounts, not throwaway accounts, and are part of the group of people that could take a survey. So 18 or older. That's a lot of assumptions here, right? 28,800. Just keep that in mind. If we look at the transgender population in the United States, right? So this is the world population state gender rankings. We take a look at that. We have a CSV here of that. I've taken and highlighted each of those states. We take a look at the sum of that value, 138,000 or 1.382 million. 1382700 divided by population of the US, which is what, 330 million? $330 million. Then that's 0.004%, which is about halfway up this chart or so. So that makes sense. That would be the reported number of the population for the US. That fits about right. So let's assume that these numbers are correct. How many people are in the world? 7.9 billion. Do we know how many adults are in the world? That's probably the better question. The adult population is about 5 billion. Okay, so let's take that number. And we multiply that. Let's assume, this is another big assumption. It's a bad assumption, but this is back of the envelope calculations. Let's assume that the population of trans people around the world is about the same as the population of trans people in the US. So this number times 0.00004%. Right? I have my numbers wrong. It's just 0.4%. So this times 100. Okay. So the approximate number of trans people in the world would be 20 million if we consider that 0.1% of them are going to be that Reddit group. How many then should there be? 0.001%. 20,000. 20,000 adults are likely to be in that group. There's 28,000. That kind of makes sense, right? So this is under the assumption that there were no bots, no doubles, no throwaways, no children, right? That everyone in this community is exactly who they report to be. And I would maintain that that is probably not the case. You're also going to have journalists in here. You're going to have people that are trying to get more information. What they're saying is, let's catch up to 2022, where there's this group of 28,000. We would expect that many people in this group. It's exactly what we would expect. Oh, no. They're back of the shelf calculations. These are back of the envelope. They are done purely for the sake of assumption, and they are not exact because this is not scientific. But this is far more scientific than simply saying, these are old statistics, let's catch up to 2022, look at this group. That is not scientific at all. No research, no studying, nothing. I am at least providing you with sources and areas where you can do your own research. You can run these numbers yourself. I have run these numbers myself, and I know what the actual numbers are. I'm just doing this on the fly, right? I would prefer if you actually went and ran these numbers yourself, to run them through your own head and to prove to yourself that this makes sense. My point is that what they're saying is that we should get to the present and that 0.1% of trans people detransitioning is inaccurate, in fact, is still accurate. It makes absolutely perfect sense with the values that we have in front of us. It makes perfect sense when we look at the world population and the statistics that we have from a few years ago. And until you bring me better statistics, I can't give you better math. Right? Because we're already making assumptions. And they're better than the assumptions of, well, I don't know, just take my word for it. Because I'm pretty. And I said so. Because that's all they've got. It is literally all they have at that point. What happens when we talk about these issues? When you find out that the methodology that we look at scrutinizing the detransitioners is flawed, well, there's actually been proven through these studies that almost $200 million has been funded towards anti-gender movements by the Russian Federation in groups like the detrans movement. And there's studies that claim that 80% of the desistance rate in trans children is caused by this kind of scrutiny. So when you confuse children and you tell them that their gender dysphoria is easy to fix and is not the result of what they think it is, and that they shouldn't follow through with what their doctor tells them, and that they should only socially transition but not medically, and that they should wait, and that none of this is good for them, and that they're making a huge mistake, all of these conservative viewpoints, you actually give them a worse outcome overall. So these are the true facts of detransitioning. And these have all of the links to go with it. Each of these is a link to a study. So that's where you can get your facts. Tons of studies here. That's all I'll say about that. Here's a puberty blocker that I did not go over. That is worth looking at as well. And I think we'll be getting into that one here in just a moment. Okay. So 19 minutes in. We're almost done. Then we'll hop into a game. So 19 minutes. Puberty is actually the most important thing a human can go through. Human being, I don't care what gender or what sex you are. It doesn't matter if human beings need puberty, yet our brain grows during puberty. So now we're going to dumb everyone down. Well, that's the thing. What sane human being thinks that a person will be healthy mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically, pausing their development, canceling their development really by 12? You trap a child in a child's mindset, and that's the kind of people we want running around. So, here's the big conspiracy. And then we'll get into the conspiracy. So, now we're really getting into it. Puberty blockers stop brain growth. Do we have any evidence for that? Or is this just a claim? So, Mayo Health Clinic. What do puberty blockers do? Primary sex characteristics, secondary sex characteristics. Benefits, what are the criteria? Are the changes permanent? No. Possible side effects. Growth spurts, bone growth and density, future fertility, headaches, hot flash, weight gain, injection site swelling. I don't see anything about brain growth there. So that's the Mayo Clinic. Here is a study on puberty and structural brain development in humans. What did we look at here? It's important to note that there are a number of physical growth and endocrine disorders that can lead to early onset or delayed patterns of pubertal maturation. These conditions are not reported on below because the current review aims to highlight the role puberty may have above and beyond age in typically developing adolescents. I'm going to link this from the NIH. But the grand thing here is at no point in any part of this study could they show that any significant rise or lowering of estrogen, estradiol, or of testosterone, did that have a true effect on brain growth. And further, the big one, or the big two, I should say, that do cause changes to brain growth are luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. Right? So those are gonadotryptans. And so I don't know how puberty blockers affect luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, but I can tell you for sure that GnRHs don't, I don't know how they affect that. So I can't speak to that. But there's no major effect in levels of estradiol and testosterone that affect brain growth. And this study shows that. And they look at children from age 6 all the way up to 25. And you expect puberty blockers to be in kids for between 2 and about 5 years max for trans kids. So again, not the same issue. So I think we're good with that one. So where do we go next? 21 minutes. Money makes people do things. And Lupron, which I've been doing some research on, they have had an actual major lawsuit, like I think it was 10 or 15 years ago, where they had to pay $825 million because they were giving Lupron to doctors and asking them and paying the doctors to promote Lupron when they knew it was so. And here they are again, doing it again. They're paying doctors. Okay. We make a claim. 10 or 15 years ago, there was a lawsuit, and they're doing it again. Do we have proof they're doing it again? Do we even talk about a lawsuit, a study, anything that we're doing again? The people are looking at and taking those hair follicle stimulation hormones are older folks. Exactly, Ellie. So let's take a look at this statement. So this is saying that really all of this is about the money, because if you can get the kids to start taking puberty blockers, then you can make more money off of the puberty blockers. So this is all about the pharmaceutical companies, right? So let's take a look at Lupron in general. What was it used for way back when? In 10 or 15 years ago. So the lawsuit that happened way back when, they pleaded guilty in 2001 to criminal charges that they violated the FDA's Marketing Act. They agreed to pay $875 million to settle claims that it paid kickbacks to doctors to promote it. And they admitted, one doctor in particular admitted that he falsified and fabricated 80% of the data in the research reports. And there's a lot of reports of adverse events linked to Lupron. So the adverse side effects of this drug can be bad, right? And you should pay attention to that. It's not supposed to be used long term. But this has nothing to do with the effects of Lupron, and it has everything to do with a doctor over promoting it, and doctors overall over promoting it because they were receiving kickbacks for that. So I am not going to link this. However, when we talk about lawsuits like this is white collar crime, right? This is white collar crime in the Food and Drug Administration and in the drug industry. So how often does this actually happen? Is Lupron an isolated incident? Or is this just the standard? So, in 2007, there was a rule change by the FDA that required manufacturers to report a list of potential side effects in their ads. And then in 2016, they required that the actor not use a tone of voice that made those side effects sound generic and boring. So the FDA has changed their rules specifically about the way that ads are advertised for drugs. And it was also found that in 64% of cases, adverse side effects are missing from published articles. So Lupron's not the only one that didn't publish their adverse side effects, right? So there were 28 individual studies that compared 500 different clinical trials and their published results in journals. And 64% of them don't report adverse side effects. So this is not just Lupron's trying to make money. This is a problem with the pharmaceutical industry in general. So to an extent, Buck Angel's not wrong here. There is a conspiracy. It's a conspiracy to make money. It's not a conspiracy to make kids take puberty blockers. That's not what Lupron is for. It's off-label. They can't even make money off of it that way. At least not the way that they would for what it is for, which is as a cancer drug. But moving on, what this does is it changes public perception, right? When we have cases that have issues like this, you actually make the public trust you less. So it's actually in Lupron's best interest to do things the proper way. So you would expect that they would not try to push this as hard so that they could make the same amount of money for their on-label actions, which is what they're trying to push for. They don't make the money off of trans kids. We've already seen it's not a whole lot of people, right? So, moving on then, heading towards the end, they do a whole lot of talking here. They fluff their own egos. So, we're going to get to the very end of this now. And so now they say, the politicization of it, we can't even get to, like, theoretically talking about gender dysphoria in the future and possibly finding a cure, because not everyone wants to talk about how transition is so faulty. And then people say, oh, that means you're raising trans people. And Buck Angel then goes into this tirade basically about how he doesn't want to be a transsexual man and he just wishes he was born as a man and didn't have to go through this and didn't have to transition and didn't have to identify as a trans person and doesn't identify as a trans person and doesn't want to use the word cis. And look at this big old pendulum effect that it's having right now where 12-year-old kids are having surgery. Can't we just fix the system? And that finishes off with this idea of we can't run the world with the rules for everyone dominated for trans people because trans people are rare. You write the rules for the majority, not for the minority. So there's two big things here. It's that why can't we just cure gender dysphoria? Find a cure for it. And we can't run the world with the rules for everyone dominated for trans people. Right? So let's look at those two. And then we'll be done with this nonsense tirade. Right? So we have a single doctor in the UK who believes that gender dysphoria could be treated without surgery and claims that it's not about brain sex, right? And in this, basically, he's looked at a couple of different brains and can't figure out if there's a difference in brain shapes, right? Rules make things more equitable, right, Tyria? Absolutely. So this one doctor believes that you might be able to change things without surgery. And this doctor's basic idea is not everyone needs surgery because not everyone is trans that has gender dysphoria. No shit. We're all on a spectrum. All of us. Right? If you are a man and you identify as a man, you might not identify as 100% man, right? You might have a little bit on the femme side or the non-binary side or whatever it is. There's a spectrum here. It is not binary. Duh. I like to think that we could all agree on that, but clearly we cannot. So I think that that's obvious. The other thing worth looking at is the definition for gender dysphoria, right? So that is when there's a mismatch between the gender you're assigned at birth and your experience of gender, right? So it's a mind and body mismatch. It's a sense of discontent or unhappiness with biological gender and the gender roles you're expected to conform to in society. There's a key phrase there. The role you're expected to conform to in society. How do you fix something that you're expected to conform to that you don't want to conform to because you are mentally incapable of conforming to it when it's societally placed upon you? You have to change the rules. That's how you fix it. Either that or you fix your head, right? And I don't think that fixing your own mind is the way to do that. I don't think you should fix the incongruencies in your own head to conform to society. We're all different for a reason, right? We know better than to try and change autistic people, right? We don't use conversion therapy for anyone anymore. At least we shouldn't. We know better at this point, don't we? Right? I know in some countries we still do that, but anyhow. So moving on, the last thought here is we can't run the world with the rules for everyone dominated for trans people because trans people are rare, and you write the rules for the majority, not the minority, right? You think Utah still does. I would not be surprised at all. So here is that. You can post that article in the Discord, Tyria. I disabled links for all except for my moderators here today because I didn't know what kind of people we could expect in chat. So just an FYI. So let's take a look at majority and minority rules. So this is at Constitution US. I don't know this site very well, but right off the bat, we have, just because a democracy succeeds at giving power to the majority does not mean it's a just government. The majority could oppress the minority and pass laws against them. Therefore, there's more to democracy or just government than preventing a minority from ruling over the majority. There needs to be balance. What a thought. So, we talk about these things, right? What are minority rights? Minority rights are things that the majority should not or is not legally allowed to take away from the minority. Not even if they can win a popular vote to take away rights. So things like freedom of speech, the right to vote, are things you cannot take away from groups of people under the Constitution, right? So in essence, minority rights are things that you give to everyone. So the ban on slavery means that no one can be a slave, right? This is how you get minority rights. You make sure that the treatment of the smallest groups in your society is the same as the treatment of the most powerful groups in your society. That's how you build these things. Or at least that's how you should build these things. So, what are the principles then? This is civicsnation.org. We have Robert's Rules of Order, and Robert's Rules of Order has been around for a very, very long time. So it's a parliamentary procedure manual in the US. It governs meetings and organizations, and it basically is the House rules, right? It ensures the rights of the minority are protected. If it be admitted that a man possessing absolute power may misuse that power by wronging his adversaries, why should not a majority be liable to the same reproach? Right? So, majority rule presented a conundrum to the founders of America precisely because, although the majority rule was needed in order for the government to function, and the principle of minority rule interfered with democracy, the majority in power could oppress a minority as easily as a king or dictator could. So, the way that we actually built the government here in the US, in theory, I know it's not the way it works, but in theory, the way that we have built this government is with the exercises on power, based on the idea of Robert's Rules of Order. We build it so that things can be balanced, and we build it so that the rules of the minority are the same as the rules for the majority. That's what a democracy should be built on. So that is that one. And last up, why are minority rights important? So minorities are the national culture, ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities whose minority status has been recognized by national legislation or internationally binding declarations. So, why does that matter? Well, there are documents and institutions that are important, right? Like the United Nations. I hope we recognize that that's important. They recognize the rights of minorities. There's a Commissioner for Human Rights. There's the European Convention on Human Rights. That's in the Council of Europe. We have it in our own constitution. There is the FCNM, which is the final convention for the protection of national minorities in Europe. This is a global issue. There's the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. So, this is everywhere, or at least it should be. So this is more European-centric than it is US-centric, but this is also worth looking at. This is the Political Youth Network. So, essentially, the thing that I say every week, all the damn time, holds true every time. Trans rights are human rights, right? When you give the same rights to everybody, everybody gets the same rights. I know that's a revolutionary concept, right? And it was the same when we took away things like don't ask, don't tell. It was the same when we allowed same-sex marriage. It didn't change the right for straight couples to get married. They still do. Surprise! And they still get married at about the same rate. That just means that other people are allowed to get married too. We didn't take away rights. We gave the same rights. And it's still an issue. People are still fighting for this. There are still counties that refuse to marry same-sex couples in a country where we ratified it federally, right? There's a reason we had to do it federally, because the states refuse. The states are an issue, right? So they get divorced at about the same rights too. Yep. Yeah, that's the way it's always going to be. So that's all I've got. I believe at this point, I have taken an hour and a half to debunk every major point in Blair White and Buck Angel's latest interview. We've done it with facts instead of claims. I've provided just about every link that I've gone to. We've gone through a good chunk of the WPATH, bunch of surveys. We've done some math off the cuff. And I think we have outright proved that every viewpoint that they've got is based on bold assertions, no evidence, and has nothing to back it up. And I think that we've proved the opposite. So, with all that said, I'm going to take a quick break, and we will come back with some Tomb Raider. I want to go spelunking. All right, I hope to see you in a few.